Get out before I call the cops. The manager's voice cracked through the diner louder than the thunder outside, sharp enough to make every fork stop halfway to every mouth in the room. Rain hammered against the windows in heavy sheets, turning the neon open sign into a blurry red stain across the wet pavement outside. Near the front door stood an old man in a soaked gray coat, water dripping from the sleeves onto the black and white tile floor beneath him. He looked exhausted, not dangerous, not angry, just tired in a way that settled deep into his shoulders. His silver hair clung to his forehead from the storm, and one trembling hand rested against the counter as if the room itself were spinning slightly beneath him. Nobody moved to help him. A woman sitting near the window quietly pulled her purse closer. Two businessmen in pressed suits avoided eye contact completely, staring into their coffee cups like the old man didn't exist. The manager folded his arms tight across his chest. "Sir, I said you need to leave. Customers are complaining." The old man opened his mouth like he wanted to explain something, but a rough cough interrupted him first. It bent his thin frame forward for a second before he steadied himself again. "I'm just trying to get warm," he said quietly. "Just for a minute. This isn't a shelter." Another flash of lightning lit up the diner windows bright white for half a second, followed immediately by a low rumble that shook the glass. Outside, the streets of downtown Chicago looked almost underwater, headlights reflecting across flooded intersections in long ribbons of gold and red. Near the kitchen doorway, 13-year-old Elijah Carter stood frozen with a stack of wet plates balanced carefully in his arms. His apron still smelled like dish soap and fryer grease from the dinner rush. He'd been working since 4 o'clock after school, scrubbing pans and carrying bus tubs for tips barely big enough to help his mother keep the lights on in their South Side apartment. His sneakers were still damp from walking 6 blocks in the storm earlier that evening, and his stomach twisted with hunger because he hadn't eaten since lunch at school. But none of that stopped him from staring at the old man by the door. Something about him didn't feel right. Not homeless exactly. Not drunk either. Just lost. The manager stepped around the counter and pointed toward the rain outside. "Now." The old man nodded slowly, almost embarrassed for existing. He reached for the door handle with shaky fingers. Cold wind immediately pushed into the diner as the door cracked open, carrying the smell of wet concrete and car exhaust inside. Elijah watched the old man step back into the storm alone. Watched cars spray dirty rainwater across the sidewalk as people rushed past pretending not to see him. Then Elijah heard it. Another cough, harsher this time. The old man grabbed the brick wall beside the diner to steady himself. Elijah didn't think. He shoved the plates onto the counter, so fast one nearly slid off the edge. "Hey," the manager snapped. "Where do you think you're going?" But Elijah was already pulling off his apron. "He can barely walk," Elijah said. "That ain't my problem," the manager replied coldly. "Clock out if you leave." Elijah looked through the rain-streaked glass one more time. The old man had only made it halfway down the block before stopping beneath a flickering streetlight, shoulders shaking from the cold. Elijah swallowed hard, grabbed the thin hoodie hanging near the kitchen door, and ran straight into the storm. Rain slapped against Elijah Carter's face so hard it almost hurt to breathe. Within seconds his hoodie was soaked through, clinging heavy against his thin shoulders as he pushed through the flooded sidewalk toward the old man beneath the flickering streetlight. Cars hissed past in the darkness, spraying dirty water across the curb, their headlights cutting through the storm like pale knives before disappearing again into the night. "Sir," Elijah shouted over the thunder. "Wait up." The old man turned slowly, blinking rain from his eyes. Up close he looked even worse than before. His lips had lost most of their color, and his hands trembled uncontrollably beneath the sleeves of his wet coat. For one brief second, Elijah saw confusion in the man's face, like he could not understand why. Someone had followed him at all. Elijah pulled the hoodie over his own head tighter and stopped in front of him, breathing hard from the run. "You should not be out here alone." The old man tried to force a small smile. "I have been alone a long time, son." His voice carried the rough softness of someone exhausted beyond words. Another cough shook through him immediately after. Elijah glanced down the street. The bus stop bench nearby was empty except for rainwater pooling across the cracked plastic seat. The convenience store across the avenue had already shut its lights off for the night. Everything around them felt cold and closed and distant. Elijah reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled bills he had earned from tips during his shift. $6.40. That was all he had until Friday. His mother would be waiting at home with canned soup stretched between the two of them again. Pretending not to notice, she always gave him the bigger portion. He swallowed hard, then looked back at the old man. "Come on," Elijah said quietly. "There is a place still open." The old man hesitated. "I cannot ask you to spend your money on me." Elijah shrugged, even though his stomach ached from hunger. "You did not ask." They crossed the street carefully through ankle-deep water while thunder rolled somewhere above the skyscrapers. Half a block away, a tiny corner deli still glowed beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. The smell of coffee and grilled onions drifted through the door the moment Elijah pushed it open. Warm air wrapped around them instantly. Behind the counter, a tired cashier barely looked up from his phone. Elijah guided the old man toward the back booth beside the fogged-up window. Rain streaked the glass in silver lines while traffic lights reflected red and yellow across the wet streets outside. The old man lowered himself into the booth slowly, like every joint in his body hurt. Elijah stepped to the counter and stared at the menu board. A small chicken soup cost $4.99. Hot tea was $1.25. He counted the damp bills twice in his hand before ordering anyway. A few minutes later, he carried the steaming bowl carefully back to the booth. The old man looked stunned when Elijah placed it in front of him. "You should eat too," he said softly. Elijah shook his head. "I ate already." It was a lie so automatic he almost believed it himself. The old man studied him for a moment, but did not argue. Instead, he wrapped both shaking hands around the teacup like it was the first warmth he had touched all day. Steam drifted slowly between them. Outside, lightning flashed again across the city skyline. "What is your name?" the old man finally asked. "Elijah Carter." "That is a strong name." Elijah gave a small smile. "My mom says it means somebody who keeps going." The old man nodded quietly at that. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The deli television muttered softly in the corner while rain battered the windows harder than before. Then Elijah noticed something strange. The old man's watch beneath his sleeve was not cheap. Neither were his shoes, even soaked with storm water. The silver cufflinks at his wrists looked old but expensive too. Nothing matched the image everyone else saw when they looked at him standing in the rain. The old man caught Elijah glancing down and gently covered the watch with his sleeve again. Not embarrassed, just thoughtful. "People see what they expect to see," he said quietly. Elijah frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" The old man stared through the rain-blurred window at the city lights beyond it. "It means sometimes the world decides who you are before you even speak." The old man finished the soup slowly, carefully, as though he had learned long ago not to rush moments of warmth when they finally came. Elijah sat across from him with his hands tucked beneath his arms, trying not to shiver too visibly now that his soaked clothes had started turning cold again. The deli lights buzzed softly overhead, while outside the storm only seemed to grow heavier. Water rushed along the curbs like shallow rivers, and every few minutes thunder rolled low across the city high-rises beyond the fogged windows. For a while the old man simply stared into his teacup, thoughtful and distant. Then he looked up at Elijah again. "You should be home," he said quietly. Elijah shrugged. "My mom works nights at Mercy Hospital Laundry Services. She will not get off until almost midnight." "And you?" "I help where I can." The old man studied the boy's face carefully now. The tired eyes, the damp curls clinging to his forehead, the sneakers beginning to separate at the soles from too many wet winters. But beneath all of it, there was still something steady in Elijah's expression. Something gentle that hardship had not managed to take away. "Most people your age would have kept walking tonight," the old man said. Elijah glanced toward the rain outside. Most people did. Silence settled between them again, not awkward, just heavy with the sound of rain and distant traffic. Then suddenly the old man reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Elijah stiffened slightly, but all the man pulled out was a folded photograph worn soft around the edges. He placed it carefully on the table. In the picture stood a younger version of the old man beside a woman with bright eyes and silver earrings. Between them was a little girl no older than 6, smiling wide while holding a red balloon. The photo looked old enough that the colors had begun fading at the corners. Elijah leaned closer. "That your family?" A faint smile touched the old man's face for the first time all night. "A long time ago." "What happened?" The old man's thumb brushed lightly across the picture. "Life happened. There was something in the way he said it that made Elijah stop asking questions. Some sadness was too deep for strangers to touch right away. A police siren wailed somewhere outside before fading into the storm again. The cashier behind the counter yawned loudly and flipped the sign near the register from open to closing in 15 minutes. Elijah looked toward the windows nervously. "Where do you live, sir?" The old man hesitated this time. Not because he did not know, but because he seemed unsure whether he should answer. Finally, he reached for a napkin and wrote down an address with slow, careful handwriting. Elijah looked at it and blinked twice. The address was downtown near Lakeshore Drive, one of the richest parts of the city. He had only been there once on a school field trip. Tall glass towers, luxury stores with security guards outside the doors, apartments that cost more money in a month than his mother probably made all year. Elijah looked back up. "You live there?" "I used to," the old man replied softly. That answer sat strangely in Elijah's chest. Before he could ask more, the old man suddenly coughed again, harder this time, gripping the edge of the table until the shaking passed. Elijah immediately stood. "Okay, we are getting you home. You already did enough." "No," Elijah said firmly. "I did not." The old man looked surprised at the tone in the boy's voice. Not disrespectful, just determined. A quiet kind of stubbornness. Elijah pulled his hoodie tighter around himself and walked to the counter to thank the cashier before returning to the booth. Together they stepped back outside into the storm. The cold hit instantly. Wind whipped rain sideways between the buildings, rattling street signs and sending newspapers tumbling down empty sidewalks. Elijah kept close beside the old man as they walked north through downtown Chicago. Every few blocks, the old man slowed to catch his breath beneath awnings or bus shelters while traffic lights reflected across puddles around their feet. More than once, Elijah noticed people staring. Some looked suspicious when they saw a poor black teenager walking beside an older white man dressed in expensive clothes. One woman crossing the street actually tightened her grip on her husband's arm and hurried away faster after glancing at Elijah. The boy noticed it immediately. He always noticed. But the old man noticed too this time. His jaw tightened slightly beneath the rain. "Does that happen often?" he asked quietly. Elijah kept walking. "Enough." The old man lowered his eyes after that. For the next several blocks, neither of them spoke at all. Only the sound of rain followed them through the glowing city night. By the time they reached the north side of downtown, Elijah could barely feel his fingers anymore. Cold rain had soaked through every layer of clothing he owned, and each breath burned sharp in his chest from the icy wind blowing off Lake Michigan. But he kept walking beside the old man anyway, matching his slower pace step for step beneath the glowing city towers overhead. Around them, the streets had grown quieter now. Most office lights were dark except for a few upper floors glowing high above the storm like floating gold boxes in the night sky. Luxury cars rolled silently through the wet intersections, while doormen in long black coats stood beneath hotel awnings watching the rain. Elijah had never liked this part of Chicago. Everything here looked polished and expensive and far away from the world he knew. Even the sidewalks felt cleaner. The old man slowed near a crosswalk and gripped a metal light pole for balance. His breathing had become shallow, uneven. Elijah looked up at him nervously. "You okay?" "Just tired." But his voice sounded weaker now. Elijah glanced at the address again, scribbled on the damp napkin in his pocket. They were close. Only a few more blocks. "Come on," Elijah said softly. "Almost there." The old man nodded once and kept moving. They passed a jewelry store with diamond necklaces glowing beneath white display lights. A valet attendant outside a luxury hotel stared openly at Elijah with narrowed eyes before quickly looking away again. Two young men in business suits stepped around a puddle and stopped talking completely as Elijah and the old man approached them. Elijah noticed all of it. He always did. He kept his eyes down and focused on the sidewalk ahead. After a few moments, the old man spoke quietly beside him. "You should not have to get used to being looked at like that." Elijah shrugged without looking up. People see a black kid in a hoodie walking around after dark and make up the rest themselves. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of his sleeves as he spoke. "Mom says some people already decide who you are before you even open your mouth." The old man fell silent at that. There was something heavy in his expression now. Regret maybe, or shame. A few blocks later, they finally turned onto a quieter street lined with tall glass residential towers. Trees bent violently in the storm winds while expensive black SUVs sat parked along the curb beneath glowing lamps. Elijah stopped walking for a second. When he saw the building number above the entrance, his eyes widened slightly. The tower stretched nearly 60 stories into the rainy night, all silver glass and marble columns, with warm golden lighting spilling across the front steps. It looked less like an apartment building and more like something from television. Elijah stared at the old man in disbelief. "This is where you live." Before the man could answer, his knees suddenly buckled slightly beneath him. Elijah lunged forward immediately and grabbed his arm before he fell completely. "Whoa, easy." The old man's face had gone pale beneath the rain. "I am all right," he whispered, though he clearly was not. Elijah wrapped the man's arm carefully around his own shoulders and guided him toward the entrance through the storm. Water splashed beneath their shoes as they climbed the wide marble steps together. Under the bright canopy lights, two uniformed doormen turned sharply the moment they saw them approaching. One was tall with silver hair and a stiff expression. The other younger, broad-shouldered, already stepping forward with suspicion hardening his face. Both men looked first at Elijah, then at the soaked old man leaning against him. Their expressions changed instantly. "Sir?" the older doorman said in confusion. "What happened?" Elijah tried to answer calmly. "He was stuck outside in the storm, and I helped him get back." But the younger guard was already moving closer, eyes locked on Elijah's soaked hoodie and worn sneakers. "Step back from him," he said sharply. Elijah blinked. "What?" "I said step away from the resident." Elijah immediately raised his free hand slightly. "I am helping him." The old man opened his mouth to speak, but another violent cough interrupted him first. The younger guard quickly stepped between them and took hold of the old man's arm. "Sir, are you okay? Did this kid bother you?" Elijah stared in disbelief. Rainwater dripped from his curls onto the marble floor beneath him, while the warmth from the lobby spilled across his soaked clothes. "No," Elijah said quietly. "I walked him here." But nobody seemed to hear him anymore. Inside the glowing lobby, several residents had already slowed to watch through the glass doors. A woman in a white coat whispered something to her husband while staring directly at Elijah. The old man finally straightened enough to speak through rough breaths. "He helped me." The older doorman's face changed instantly. "Wait, Mr. Whitmore." Both guards froze. For one long second, the storm outside seemed quieter than the silence beneath the entrance lights. The younger guard's face drained of color almost instantly. Rain continued pounding against the glass canopy overhead, while the older doorman stepped forward in disbelief, staring hard at the soaked man beside Elijah like he was seeing a ghost. "Mr. Whitmore," he repeated softly, almost breathless now. "We have been trying to reach you for hours." Walter Whitmore lifted one tired hand weakly. "I know." His voice sounded rough and thin beneath the storm. "My phone died." The younger guard immediately straightened his posture. "Sir, we should get you inside right away." Elijah slowly stepped back, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked standing there beneath the gold lobby lights. Water dripped steadily from his hoodie onto the polished marble floor, while residents inside continued staring through the glass doors. A little girl near the elevators tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something Elijah could not hear. Her mother quickly guided her away without looking at him directly. Walter noticed. His tired eyes lingered there for a second before shifting back toward Elijah. "This young man helped me tonight," he said firmly. "He kept me from collapsing 3 blocks away." The older doorman immediately nodded. "Of course, sir." But the younger one still looked uncomfortable, avoiding Elijah's eyes now as though ashamed of his earlier suspicion. Walter's breathing suddenly hitched again into another harsh cough. The older guard moved quickly. "We need medical upstairs immediately." Within seconds, the lobby doors swung open and warm air spilled across Elijah's soaked clothes. 2 staff members rushed forward with concern flooding their faces the moment they recognized Walter Whitmore. One woman nearly gasped aloud. "Oh my God!" Elijah stood frozen near the entrance while everyone crowded around the old man. Expensive shoes crossed the marble floor in every direction. Voices overlapped. Somebody called for the private elevator. Another employee hurried toward the concierge desk with a phone pressed tightly against his ear. The entire atmosphere inside the building had changed in seconds. Elijah watched quietly from the doorway, almost invisible again now that the important man had been identified. The same people who ignored him moments earlier now moved with panic and urgency around Walter Whitmore, like the entire building breathed according to his heartbeat. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the puddle forming beneath his sneakers. He should leave. That thought settled heavily into his chest. This world was not built for kids like him to stay long. Walter suddenly turned his head toward the entrance. Elijah. The boy looked up immediately. The old man motioned him closer with one trembling hand. Elijah stepped forward carefully while dozens of eyes followed him across the marble floor. Up close, Walter looked exhausted beyond words now, his face pale beneath the lobby lights. But his eyes remained clear. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Most people would have walked past me tonight." Elijah shook his head once. "You looked like you needed help." A faint sadness crossed Walter's face then. "That is exactly why I am thanking you." The private elevator doors opened with a soft chime behind them. Staff members waited anxiously nearby. One woman held a wool blanket, while another carried bottled water and towels. Elijah stepped back again awkwardly. "You should go upstairs, sir." Walter nodded slowly but did not move immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his soaked coat and removed the old photograph from earlier. His thumb brushed softly across the faded image before sliding it carefully back inside again. "You remind me of someone I once knew," he murmured. Elijah frowned slightly, unsure what to say. Before he could answer, another sharp cough bent Walter forward again. The older doorman quickly supported him toward the elevator. Staff members surrounded him protectively as the lobby fell nearly silent. Except for the storm outside. Just before the elevator doors closed, Walter looked back one final time. "Do not lose your kindness, Elijah Carter," he said softly. "The world loses enough of it every day." Then the elevator door slid shut. Silence lingered in the lobby afterward. Nobody moved for several seconds. Finally, the younger guard cleared his throat awkwardly and glanced toward Elijah. "Kid, I did not realize." Elijah gave a small tired shrug before he could finish. "It is okay." But it was not really okay. Both of them knew that. The younger guard lowered his eyes anyway. Elijah turned toward the glass entrance doors. Outside, rain still crashed against the city streets in silver waves beneath the streetlights. The warmth of the lobby suddenly made him aware of just how cold he had become. His fingers ached. His shoes squished with every step. The older doorman quickly reached into his coat pocket. "Wait." Elijah paused near the doors. The man pulled out several crisp $100 bills and held them toward him carefully. For helping him. Elijah stared at the money for a long second. It was probably more cash than he had ever held at one time in his life. Enough to help his mother with rent. Enough to buy groceries that lasted longer than canned soup and noodles. Enough to matter. But after a quiet moment, Elijah slowly shook his head. "No, thank you." Both guards looked surprised. Elijah glanced once toward the elevator Walter had disappeared into. "I did not help him for money." Then before either man could answer, Elijah pulled his soaked hood over his head and stepped back out alone into the storm. The storm had finally begun to weaken by the time Elijah reached the south side again. Rain no longer crashed from the sky in violent sheets, but drifted steadily through the cold night in thin silver lines beneath the streetlights. Water still dripped from fire escapes and old brick buildings, while distant traffic hummed softly across the wet streets. Elijah walked slower now, exhausted from the long trip downtown and back. His soaked hoodie clung heavily to his shoulders, and every few steps his sneakers gave a quiet squishing sound against the sidewalk. But despite the cold, despite the ache in his legs, his mind stayed fixed on the old man's face beneath those gold lobby lights. Walter Whitmore. Elijah had heard that name before. Everybody in Chicago had. Whitmore Global owned half the skyline downtown. Hospitals, hotels, construction projects, scholarship foundations. His mother once pointed at one of the tall glass towers during a bus ride and said people like that lived in a completely different world from theirs. Tonight, Elijah had accidentally walked beside that world through the rain. He turned onto his block just after midnight. The apartment buildings here leaned slightly with age, their windows glowing warm against the darkness while old radiators rattled behind thin walls. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried briefly before going quiet again. The smell of fried food and wet concrete hung in the cold air. Elijah climbed the narrow front steps to apartment 2B and quietly unlocked the door. Inside, the apartment was dim except for the kitchen light left on above the stove. The old ceiling fan clicked softly overhead, while rain tapped gently against the windows now. His mother sat asleep at the small kitchen table in her blue hospital scrubs, one hand still resting beside an unpaid electric bill and a cold cup of coffee. Elijah stopped for a moment, just watching her. Denise Carter looked older lately. The long overnight shifts at Mercy Hospital had carved tired shadows beneath her eyes she could not hide anymore. Even asleep, her shoulders looked tense, like life never fully let go of her. Elijah quietly slipped off his soaked sneakers near the door and grabbed a towel from the bathroom before kneeling beside the old radiator to dry them as best he could. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and tomato soup. Home. Denise stirred lightly at the sound. Her eyes opened slowly before widening the second she saw him drenched head to toe. Elijah. She stood immediately. Baby, what happened? I am okay, he said quickly. I just got caught in the storm. But mothers always heard what children tried to hide. Denise walked closer, concern tightening across her tired face as she touched his freezing hands. Your fingers are ice cold. Elijah lowered his eyes slightly. I helped somebody tonight. Denise studied him carefully now while he explained everything. The diner, the old man, the walk through the storm, the building downtown, Walter Whitmore. At first, she listened silently, but the moment Elijah mentioned the guards downstairs mistaking him for trouble, something painful flickered across her face. Not surprise. Recognition. I knew that part was coming before you even said it, she murmured softly. Elijah sat quietly at the kitchen table while she reheated soup on the stove. Steam slowly filled the tiny kitchen, fogging the window above the sink where rainwater slid softly down the glass outside. You did the right thing, Denise finally said. Even when people do not deserve kindness, you still give it because it says something about you. Not them. Elijah looked down at the chipped table surface. They looked at me like I was dangerous. Denise sighed gently as she placed the warm soup in front of him. Some people see our skin before they see our heart. That is their failure, not yours. The apartment fell quiet again except for the rain and the hum of the radiator. Elijah wrapped both hands around the soup bowl slowly, letting the warmth sink back into his aching fingers. Then after a long pause, he spoke softly. He looked sad. Denise glanced at him. Who? Mr. Whitmore. Elijah stared at the steam rising from the soup. Not rich sad. Real sad. Denise sat down across from him now, studying her son's face carefully. Sometimes the loneliest people live in the biggest buildings. Elijah thought about the photograph Walter carried inside his coat. The woman with silver earrings. The little girl holding the balloon. The way his voice changed when he said life happened. Outside, the storm finally began drifting farther across the city. Rain softened against the windows while the distant skyline glowed faintly through the darkness miles away. Elijah ate quietly while his mother watched him with tired but gentle eyes. Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked briefly across the street beneath the flickering lamp outside before slowly driving away again into the wet Chicago night. Elijah woke the next morning to the sound of car doors closing outside the apartment building. At first he thought he had dreamed it. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a cold gray morning where rainwater still clung to broken sidewalks and fire escapes. Pale sunlight filtered weakly through the thin curtains beside the couch, where Elijah had fallen asleep after finishing his soup. The radiator hissed softly nearby. Then came another sound, a knock at the downstairs entrance. Firm, measured, not the impatient pounding of neighbors or delivery drivers. Elijah sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His mother was already awake in the kitchen, tying back her hair before another shift at Mercy Hospital. The smell of toast and instant coffee drifted through the apartment. Another knock echoed faintly downstairs. Denise frowned toward the window. Who in the world? She stepped carefully to the curtain and pulled it aside slightly. The moment she looked outside, her entire expression changed. 3 black SUVs sat parked along the curb in front of the building, polished and gleaming beneath the wet morning light. Men in dark suits stood near the entrance, speaking quietly into earpieces while several neighbors peeked through windows up and down the block. One elderly woman had already stepped onto her fire escape, wrapped in a robe, just to watch. Elijah's stomach tightened instantly. Denise turned slowly toward him. Elijah, she whispered carefully. What exactly happened last night? Before he could answer, footsteps echoed up the apartment stairs. Then another knock sounded directly at their door. The tiny apartment suddenly felt even smaller somehow. Denise wiped her hands nervously on her scrubs before opening the door halfway. Standing outside was a tall black man in an expensive charcoal suit, holding a leather folder against his chest. Beside him stood a younger woman with silver earrings and a cream-colored coat despite the cold weather. Both carried the calm, polished posture of people used to important rooms and expensive silence. The man offered a respectful nod immediately. "Good morning. I apologize for arriving unannounced." His voice was smooth and professional. "We are looking for Elijah Carter." Denise instinctively stiffened slightly beside the door. Years of surviving hard neighborhoods had taught her to fear unexpected attention from wealthy strangers. "Why?" she asked cautiously. The woman beside him smiled gently, then glanced past Denise toward Elijah, standing near the couch. "Because Walter Whitmore asked for him personally." Elijah froze. The room went completely quiet except for the soft hum of the radiator. The man opened the leather folder slowly. Inside was a photograph printed from a security camera near the downtown residential tower. It showed Elijah supporting Walter through the storm beneath the entrance lights. "Mr. Whitmore became seriously ill last night," the man explained carefully. "The doctors said things could have ended very differently if your son had not helped him get home when he did." Denise looked at Elijah now with stunned disbelief. "Baby," Elijah swallowed hard. "Is he okay?" The woman answered softly this time. "He is stable this morning." And the first thing he asked when he woke up was where to find the boy who stayed with him in the rain. Something shifted in Denise's face then. Relief, pride, fear, all tangled together. Down the hallway, apartment doors had quietly cracked open. Neighbors peeked through narrow openings, pretending not to stare, while clearly listening to every word. Mrs. Alvarez from 2A openly gasped when she heard the name Whitmore. Elijah suddenly felt embarrassed standing there in old sweatpants and mismatched socks, while these elegant strangers filled the hallway with expensive perfume and polished shoes. The suited man looked toward Elijah directly now. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you if you are comfortable with that." Elijah blinked. "Me? Yes." The woman smiled softly. "He has not stopped talking about you." Denise crossed her arms carefully. Protective now. "Why would a billionaire want to see my son?" The suited man paused before answering honestly. "Because your son treated him like a human being when almost nobody else did." Silence settled over the apartment after that. Heavy. Real. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the worn carpet beneath his feet. He thought about the old man sitting alone beneath the storm outside the diner while people turned away. The photograph in his coat pocket. The sadness in his voice. Denise slowly placed one hand against Elijah's shoulder. Her eyes looked watery now, though she tried hiding it. "You hear that?" she whispered softly. "That kindness I keep telling you not to lose?" Elijah looked up at her quietly. Denise gave a small trembling smile. "Looks like somebody important finally saw it too." Outside the apartment window, neighbors continued gathering near the sidewalk beneath the gray morning sky, while the black SUVs waited silently at the curb like something out of another world entirely. The ride downtown felt unreal. Elijah sat quietly in the back seat of the black SUV beside his mother while the city rolled past the tinted windows in long gray reflections left behind by the storm. Denise kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her hospital scrubs, clearly uncomfortable inside the leather interior that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. Across from them sat the woman with silver earrings, her posture calm and elegant even as morning traffic crawled through wet intersections outside. "My name is Vanessa Whitmore," she finally said softly. "Walter is my father." Elijah looked up immediately. Now he saw the resemblance. The same thoughtful eyes. The same tired sadness hidden beneath calm expressions. Vanessa gave him a gentle smile. "He has not spoken this much in months." Denise frowned slightly. "Is he very sick?" Vanessa looked toward the rain-streaked window for a moment before answering. "My father built an empire, but after my mother and little sister died years ago, something in him disappeared too." Elijah immediately thought of the old photograph. The balloon. The silver earrings. Vanessa noticed the recognition in his face. "He showed you the picture, did he not?" Elijah nodded quietly. Vanessa lowered her eyes. "That was the last happy summer we had together." Silence settled softly inside the SUV after that while downtown Chicago rose around them again in steel and glass beneath the cloudy morning sky. When they arrived at the hospital, everything moved quickly. Staff members opened doors before they even reached them. Nurses nodded respectfully at Vanessa as they passed through polished hallways that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh coffee. Elijah stayed close beside his mother, suddenly very aware of his worn hoodie and faded jeans among all the clean white walls and expensive suits surrounding them. Finally, Vanessa stopped outside a private hospital room high above the city. Through the large window at the far side of the room, the skyline stretched beneath pale sunlight, breaking through the clouds for the first time since the storm. Walter Whitmore sat upright in bed wearing a gray sweater instead of the soaked coat from the night before. His silver hair was neatly combed now, but the moment he saw Elijah step into the room, something warmer than wealth entered his tired face. Relief. Real relief. "There he is," Walter said softly. Elijah smiled a little despite himself. "You look better." Walter chuckled faintly. "That is because I am indoors this time." Vanessa moved quietly toward her father while Denise remained near the doorway, unsure whether she truly belonged inside a room like this. Walter noticed immediately. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "please come in." Denise stepped closer cautiously. Walter studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You raised a remarkable young man." Denise looked toward Elijah with pride softening her tired face. "I just try to raise him right." Walter nodded slowly. "That is rarer than people think." A quiet silence followed while morning light spilled across the room in pale gold reflections. Then Walter looked back toward Elijah. "I owe you an apology." Elijah blinked in confusion. "For what?" Walter's eyes darkened slightly with regret. "For the way people looked at you while you helped me." Elijah lowered his gaze toward the floor. Walter continued carefully. "The guards downstairs have worked in my building for years. They recognized my watch before they recognized your kindness." The words hung heavy in the room. Vanessa looked visibly uncomfortable now. "Father," but Walter raised one hand gently. "No, it matters." He looked back at Elijah again. "You carried me through a storm while others closed doors in my face. Yet somehow you were still the one treated with suspicion." Elijah shifted awkwardly. "I am used to it." Walter's expression tightened instantly. "You should never have to be." For a moment nobody spoke. Outside the giant hospital windows, sunlight finally broke through the clouds completely, turning the wet streets below into ribbons of gold. Then Walter reached toward the bedside table beside him. Resting there was a small envelope. He handed it carefully toward Elijah. "This is for your education," he said quietly. "Full tuition through college. Whatever school you choose one day." Denise inhaled sharply beside him. Elijah stared at the envelope, but did not take it immediately. "Sir, that is too much." Walter smiled faintly. "No. Too much was a 13-year-old boy spending his last $6 on soup for a stranger." Elijah finally accepted the envelope slowly, almost afraid to touch it. His hands trembled slightly. Denise pressed one hand gently against her mouth, tears filling her eyes despite her efforts to stop them. Vanessa stepped closer then, looking directly at Elijah. "My father spent years surrounded by powerful people," she said softly. "But last night the person who truly showed him humanity was a tired kid walking home in the rain." Walter's eyes glistened faintly now as he looked toward Elijah again. "You reminded me that goodness still exists in this city." Elijah stood there quietly beneath the morning light pouring across the hospital room, holding the envelope carefully in both hands while downtown Chicago shimmered far below them outside the glass. 3 weeks later, the city felt different after the storm. Chicago had settled back into its normal rhythm of rushing trains, glowing traffic lights, and cold wind curling between tall buildings downtown. But for Elijah Carter, small things had begun changing quietly. Not flashy changes. Not the kind people posted online. Just little moments that felt strange at first. The landlord downstairs suddenly stopped threatening. Eviction notices every month. Denise no longer skipped meals pretending she already ate at work. And every Thursday afternoon, a black sedan arrived outside Elijah's school to drive him downtown for tutoring sessions arranged through the Whitmore Foundation. Still, Elijah wore the same faded hoodie most days. Still walked carefully home past broken sidewalks and corner stores with buzzing neon signs. Some things stayed part of you no matter what changed around you. On a gray Friday evening, Elijah pushed open the door to the same diner where everything had started. The bell above the entrance gave the same tired jingle as before. Warm air smelling like coffee and grilled onions wrapped around him instantly, while rain tapped softly against the windows outside again, lighter this time, calmer. The dinner crowd had thinned, leaving only a few customers scattered across booths beneath the buzzing lights. Elijah paused near the doorway for a second. The manager looked up from behind the register and froze immediately when he recognized him. His entire posture shifted with visible discomfort. "Elijah," he said awkwardly. Hey." Elijah simply nodded once. Nothing angry in his face. Nothing proud either. Just quiet. The manager wiped his hands nervously against his apron before stepping around the counter. "Listen, about that night." His words stumbled slightly. "I did not know who he was." Elijah looked at him for a long moment while rainwater traced silver lines across the diner windows behind them. Then he answered softly, "That was kind of the problem." The manager lowered his eyes immediately after that. Silence settled heavily between them. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clattered softly while an old soul song played low from the diner's speakers overhead. Finally, the manager cleared his throat. "Your meal is on the house tonight." Elijah gave a small shrug. "I only came for hot chocolate." The manager nodded quickly. "Then it is definitely on the house." Elijah slid quietly into the same booth near the fogged-up window where Walter Whitmore had sat weeks earlier, holding warm tea between trembling hands. Outside, downtown traffic reflected across the wet streets in long streaks of red and gold. The manager returned a few minutes later carrying a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with melting whipped cream. He placed it carefully on the table without meeting Elijah's eyes fully. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you did something good that night." Elijah wrapped both hands around the warm mug. Everybody could have. The manager looked like he wanted to say something else, but could not find the words. After a moment, he simply nodded and walked away slowly. Elijah sat alone beside the rain-streaked window while the warmth from the cup spread through his cold fingers. Across the street, people hurried beneath umbrellas without looking up much, same as always. The city had not magically changed overnight. Some people would still look at him with suspicion before kindness. Some doors would still close faster than they should. But now Elijah understood something important. Kindness was not weakness. It was the one thing strong enough to survive in places where humanity sometimes disappeared. The diner bell suddenly jingled again. Elijah looked up as Walter Whitmore stepped slowly inside wearing a dark wool coat and scarf this time, healthy enough to stand without shaking. Vanessa followed just behind him, carrying an umbrella still dripping rainwater onto the floor mat near the entrance. The entire diner seemed to recognize Walter instantly. Conversations quieted. Forks paused halfway through meals. But Walter ignored all of it. His eyes found Elijah immediately near the window booth. A warm smile slowly crossed the old man's face. "Mind if an old man joins you for hot chocolate this time?" Elijah smiled back before sliding over in the booth to make room. Outside the window, rain continued falling softly across Chicago while inside the little diner, warm light reflected gently across the glass. No speeches followed. No dramatic music. Just three people sitting quietly together while the city moved around them beyond the storm-streaked window. And for the first time in a very long while, Walter Whitmore no longer looked alone.